families. My name's Rebecca English. I'm a senior lecturer in education at QUT here in Queensland. And today I'm talking to you about some of the educational options that might work for you when you have a young person in your family who is living with chronic pain. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen, and then we're going to talk through what I'm going to talk about today, and then I'm just going to jump straight in. So my presentation today is called Learning Through Pain, Reimagining Education for Kids in Pain. And I'm going to start off today by talking a little bit about what I mean when I talk about mainstream schooling, and then what I mean when I talk about homeschooling, which is increasingly an option for families who are finding mainstream school difficult for myriad reasons. We'll talk about those. I'm then going to talk a little bit about why it would be effective for young people living with chronic pain and how it can help to ameliorate some of the issues that young people face when they are in mainstream school and have experiences of pain. I'm then going to talk about how families go about it, what it looks like in a family to homeschool. I'm also going to talk about socialization, which is a huge bugbear for homeschoolers, but it's one we always need to talk about nonetheless. I'm then going to talk about legislation, what are the requirements, how it differs state by state and territory by territory. And I'm also going to help you to understand how we can communicate better with medical practitioners, maybe who aren't supportive, and also family members, because one of the issues that often is raised with me is, what do I do when grandma doesn't agree? And finally, I'm going to give you some options for where to go when you want some more information or you're starting this journey and you don't really know where to go. And also I'll give you my contact details so we can keep this conversation going if that's what you would like to do. So let's start. I'm going to set the scene first of all. And I'm going to set the scene by talking a little bit about mainstream. What is mainstream? Well, mainstream schooling is really the school that you and I probably went to. It's the same school, the one that's down the road. It goes from prep or reception right the way to grade 12. And it has, a fairly standard offering. In Queensland, we would talk about it having 8 key learning areas, which I'm not going to list because I can never remember them all. And in different states and territories, it's different. Basically, it's a school that offers the Australian curriculum, or a recognised alternative, but really the Australian curriculum, and it's taught in a fairly sequential manner. Now, in some states and territories, you can enrol in part-time school. That is part of the Education Act. For example, in Victoria, you can negotiate with a principal to do school part-time. If you're in other states and territories and you enrol in a flexi school, you can do part-time school, but part-time school is not available in mainstream. Distance education is a mainstream school that is delivered at home. It again teaches the Australian curriculum and does so in that same sequential fashion. Now, there are lots of alternative schools, and special assistance schools are one of them, as I've listed there, and they are an increasingly growing part of the Australian education landscape. Something like 300% more special assistance schools have popped up recently compared to 23% of mainstream schools, and they are often flexible. They are for students who are at risk of disengaging from mainstream school, but they aren't a mainstream school. A mainstream school is just teaches the Australian curriculum, does so in a sequential fashion. It's generally expected that you go there full time and you'll go there from prep or reception or whatever it's called in your state and territory, right the way through to the final year of school, which is grade 12. Now, homeschooling is not like any of those options I've talked about. While you can take a Montessori approach or a Steiner approach in homeschooling, it is not a school. Homeschooling in Australia is defined as the education of the child outside of a formal institution such as a school. It's different from distance ed, which is a school. It's also different from what happened during lockdown, which was also a school. And the difference is that the locus of control, the placement of the control of what that child is learning, their reporting and their registration with state authorities is done from the behest of the parent, not through a school. In all other options, the school does that. It's important to know that it is legal in every state and territory and that it is equivalent to school. It is done in place of school, and that there are around, in 2025, 45,000 homeschoolers in Australia, with the most as a percentage of the population being in Tasmania, which we'll see in a little bit, and the second biggest group as a percentage of population is in Queensland. So let's talk a little bit about the rise in home education in Australia. We can see that from this graph that it has grown massively. New South Wales has the most homeschooled students, and South Australia and Tasmania, because of their smaller population, have lower numbers. The Northern Territory, which is very low, which we'll show in a minute, is not on the map because it's quite a small amount. This is a graphic provided by Fearless Homeschool, who is one of the groups that are providing lots of advice to families who are thinking about homeschooling their children. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these numbers. So here's a table from the 2024 data of the total home educated students as a ratio of full-time school students. We can see that the highest is in Tasmania, where there is a really nice regulatory environment for families. Families tend to find registration in Tasmania pretty smooth and easygoing. We can see that Western Australia has about 16 per 1,000, also a reasonably nice place to register. And then there's Queensland. Queensland has had the highest growth of all the states and territories, and it's pretty insane how many Queensland families choose to homeschool. So let's have a look at the Queensland data. You can see here from this Queensland data that there's about bit over 5,500 in both primary and secondary years, and that is increasingly popular among secondary and senior secondary young people who are choosing to homeschool. We can also see from this data that the number drops off in year 12. The government in Queensland is about to introduce legislation to allow you to register till you're 18. So we should see those numbers radically increase in the coming years. But at the moment, once a child turns 17, they are no longer registered for homeschooling. This is the growth that we've experienced in Queensland over the 5 years to 2024. We can see that some of the years has had a massive growth, and that tends to be associated with huge changes in that child's educational journey. For example, grade 7, when they move into high school, that tends to be a time when for young people who are experiencing educational issues, such as those young people living with chronic pain, it can be a big step to go to high school. It can be quite a lot on that young person, so they tend to choose homeschooling at that point. Similarly, around grade 9, when just before senior, when the work starts to get a bit more intense, is another time. And then year 11, when they're in senior, is another time when the demands become too much, particularly when there are other factors at play in that young person's life. So it tends to be a big time of transition. So it's a nice time for them to choose homeschooling. All right, I'm going to talk now a little bit about why homeschooling might be of benefit for the pain community. So let's talk a little bit about what benefits we know accrue to homeschoolers, particularly those young people who have educational issues that they face at school and find attending school difficult. So we know from research that homeschooling suits kids who are struggling to fit in mainstream. Now, they may be struggling to fit in for a number of reasons, integration, like a lot of different reasons, or just one of these reasons. So students who have special needs in education often find they are better served in homeschooling. Why might that be? Well, studies I have done with students in out-of-home care, as well as studies of students who have regular OT appointments, psychologists, other specialists, other care needs, tend to find that homeschooling works best because there's less disruption. So if you have a child who has to regularly see a specialist, there is none of that shame where parent turns up, parent takes the child out of the classroom in the middle of class or at lunchtime, and then they may return to school having missed some lessons in the middle of the day because they've had to see their specialist, or all specialist appointments need to be scheduled outside of school hours, which can be very difficult to get. Having that sort of gentleness of being at home and not having the same expectations that you have in mainstream school can be a huge benefit to those young people. Research also suggests that students who have trouble with attendance find homeschooling is better in the sense that it allows for much more continuity of learning because you can do it at home and you can do it at a time that suits you. There is no need to schedule it like there is with mainstream school. It tends to work better. And some of those troubles with attendance can be like lots of different things, and they can include having trouble with pain, so they cannot get up and go to school. Getting dressed is an issue, but they also can include students who are suffering with school refusal or school can't, and those young people tend to find that a period of homeschooling is really beneficial for them. Another group of young people who benefit are those who have different social needs, which we can discuss a little bit more in a minute. So, socialization is one of those concerns that's constantly raised with anybody who has anything to do with homeschooling. And it is one of those ones that tends to, I'm going to say, irritate some people in homeschooling. So, the when you talk to homeschoolers about socialization, they will give you one of two responses. The first one will be that school is the only time in your life when you are expected to spend all day, every day in a group with people. And those people are roughly 6 months older or younger than you. So it's not a very true reflection of the social world in which we all naturally inhabit and live. And it's not really a true reflection of the social world into which we sort of evolved to live. The second issue that's often raised by parents is that they will say, oh, you're talking about bullying. And then they will tell you that bullying is never okay. We seem to think that it is for young people. They need to learn to be bullied. Well, at what point does bullying become not okay for young people? Is it when they turn 18? Is it when they turn 21? Is it when they turn 25? And if bullying is such a great social experience and it pushes us to be better, why then does every large organization have human resources sections that are devoted to stamping out bullying? And why, too, do schools advertise that they have low bullying rates and that they have lots of policies that help with bullying? So we can push socialization to one side and say it's not really a thing that we need to think about. When you look at the research around the social outcomes of homeschooling, and remembering that outcomes are very rarely front of mind for families who are choosing homeschooling, usually it is because school is becoming a difficult situation for that young person and they can no longer attend. So when we look at the social outcomes, research suggests that homeschooled children, graduates, are actually better socialized than their conventionally schooled peers. It suggests that they're much more likely to get married, to enjoy civic engagement, to be active in their community, and to have a job and a career than students who've come from a mainstream pathway. They also tend academically to do better across all areas except maths, and that can be compensated for, fixed, whatever word you want to use, through tutoring or other options that you have. Now, when we think about how homeschoolers socialize, we know that homeschoolers are able to socialize in all the same ways that school young people do. So if your young person is a swimmer, there is nothing stopping your young person from continuing to swim. If your young person does some kind of like gymnastics or anything, they can still do all of those same things that conventionally schooled peers do. There's no stop on your young person participating in those same activities that they currently practice or that schooled kids currently engage in. In addition, young people who are homeschooled can meet up through specialized groups, co-ops, meetups. There's often small micro schools with a specific focus, say on science or on literacy or on drama or on dance or anything that they can join that are just for homeschool groups. Homeschoolers do all sorts of amazing experiences, including circus, including archery, including all sorts of things. So there's no impediment to socialization by choosing homeschooling. There is also no impediment to university entrance, and increasingly, universities are looking at the ways that they can recruit homeschoolers because they want them, because they know that the research suggests they do well academically, as I said, and they're much more likely to succeed at university because they're self-directed, they know the way that they learn, and they understand their own limitations and can work around them. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about this no real impediment to university entrance, if I may. So research shows that homeschoolers do as well or better than their mainstream schooled peers. So I'd like to caveat this with there is no real way to match, because while we can match in terms of socioeconomic status and age and place, and the research comes from the US, it is not like for like. Homeschooling is very much more directed by a child in a way that they can have some power and agency over how they learn that you can't do in a mainstream school. I would also like to add that outcomes are really front of mind, like I said, when you're thinking about choosing homeschooling because you're at an impasse in school. But there is no problem that is shown in the research that will come from homeschooling. So I've done a bit of research recently into homeschoolers' transition to university. Based on the research that I had read, I was interested to know if in Australia they had struggled with the transition, but none of the participants in my study described the struggle to transition, and all of them were very capable. All bar one of my participants had completed the university degree into which they had enrolled. Most of them said that they had had lots of time to practice how to learn in a way that responds to a university style of teaching, because they had plenty of time to self-direct projects and do project-based learning. They knew how to work independently. They didn't need to rely constantly on supervision from a teacher. They knew their own minds and how they learnt. And they were able to practice many of the skills that they wished to learn at university prior to going. So students who were interested in computer programming, for example, were able to practice computer programming. Students who were really interested in doing essays style approaches had lots of co-ops where they had met up with other young people looking at going to university and practiced those skills. Similarly for research. And what we have found is that there's types of students who choose homeschooling and who experience homeschooling are exactly the types of students that universities want, because they're really good at being independent, self-directed, self-managed learners. So let's continue. So why do families report choosing homeschooling? And there are lots of reasons, and many of them are actually quite interconnected. So one of the common reasons that we see in the research about why families report choosing homeschooling is bullying. If the child is bullied at school, it can make them not want to attend for many obvious reasons. And we've already talked about human resources in industry and why bullying is not okay in industry, and why it's not okay to use bullying as a reason for kids to stay in school if they are struggling. But young people often report that they've been bullied to such a degree they don't want to go back to school, so they end up in homeschooling. Another common reason that we see, and the Queensland government has data on this, is neurodivergence, where a young person is neurodiverse and finds the classroom environment quite overwhelming. It's quite noisy. There's lots of moving parts constantly. There's really bright lights in the room. There's lots of verbal instruction from a teacher. All of these may coalesce into a situation where learning at school does not suit that child's learning needs, so they end up in homeschooling. Special education needs is another one that often leads to homeschooling. You know, I have heard of children with all sorts of conditions who have found that homeschooling is actually just a much better approach for them, works much better for their learning needs. And all of these, of course, can lead to school can't, which is a big issue for young people. And research into school can't shows that a period of homeschooling can often be exactly what that young person needs, and then they can get on with the getting on of learning in a way that suits them. Another increasingly common report that we're seeing is families being forced into homeschooling, sometimes due to school disciplinary absences, otherwise known as, any kind of disciplinary measure where the school sends the child home for a short while, so a suspension maybe, or even an expulsion. And also, if the school is unable to provide adequate modifications to ensure inclusion, families report that the school will often suggest that homeschooling is probably the option for them, and they might like to consider it. So all of these are reasons that we see in research about why families end up choosing homeschooling. Let's talk a little bit about regulatory requirements. So say you're thinking, yeah, this sounds like a really great idea. My child would probably really benefit from a period at least of homeschooling. How do I go about doing it? So I'd like to start off this section by saying that homeschooling is equivalent to school. In all states and territories, you can get a certificate of education through homeschooling. You cannot get an ATAR. And that what we need to sometimes remember is that family members and medical practitioners may be a little anxious about our child not attending school, because school is normal. It's what normally happens. Although I will say less and less school happens. Homeschooling is the fastest growing educational choice in the country. It's growing faster than any other school type, even special assistance schools. And it's one that we are going to increasingly see young people have a crack at during their educational journeys. So let's talk about the regulatory requirements. Again, it's a legal option in every state and territory. It is written into every state and territory Education Act. It is as good as, or equal to, if you wish to say, any school option. And most homeschooling families will tell you that for that young person who has decided to go into homeschooling, it works much better than going to school. It's central to how we understand education in Australia, which is driven by the parents. It is about parental choice. Parents have a right to choose an education pathway that suits the young person in their home. And for some young people, that is homeschooling. However, each state and territory has a different requirement for how to register for homeschooling. We need to remember that homeschooling is written into education acts. They are managed at state level. They are about school education. They are in place of a school education. Some are quite easy to choose homeschooling in, such as the ACT, and some are quite hard, such as New South Wales. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I'll go through this amazing graphic that has been produced by the Sydney Home Education Network that talks you through the different legislative requirements. Now, some states, such as Queensland, will allow you to modify your child's plan to meet your child's needs. So if you need a special plan for your child because of them, for example, living with chronic pain, you are able to do that in Queensland. So you may not have to meet the same regulatory requirements as what I'm going to talk about in a minute. So we can see from this graphic that it's kind of messy. There's lots of different moving parts in each of the different states and territories. So I'm going to talk through each one individually, and then we can sort of think about what this might mean for you if this is something that you're interested in choosing for yourself. So I'm going to start with the ACT because the ACT is probably the easiest or most family-friendly place to register. So in the ACT, you send in an application to homeschool your child, and immediately on receipt of that application, that child is registered. You do not have to teach the Australian curriculum, or New South Wales is the only one with its own state syllabus or a state syllabus in senior or in junior. At no point does an authorised person come from the education department to your home to visit you. And we can talk a little bit about why that's a big thing in a minute. But at some point within the first 3 months after registration, you need to meet at the office where they'll go through the plan with you, help you in areas where they might see some deficits, and then you report yearly. Now, the child is not sighted. Now, this is important because if your child has had quite negative experiences of schooling and is quite anxious because of their school experience, meeting an authorised person or someone from the department can be quite overwhelming for that young person, and it's not going to aggravate or stress that young person out that they have to see somebody from a department. Let's keep going. In Victoria, it's very rare to be rejected, almost not at all. You're assessed within 28 days of the department receiving your application. You do have to plan around 8 key learning areas, but not to the same degree of depth that you do, say, in New South Wales. There is no state syllabus mandated and no requirement to use the Australian curriculum. You're just going to talk about how you're going to teach English, how you're going to teach maths, how you're going to teach science, etc., etc. The child is not sighted and they do not need to come to your home. And registration is discontinued yearly with a notification of your intention to continue. And sometimes you may be audited to see if you're going okay, but families generally report they do not ever have any kind of auditing requirement. It's a really nice place to homeschool as well. Let's talk about South Australia. So in South Australia, you don't apply for homeschooling, you apply for an exemption from school attendance for the purposes of home education. Within 5 weeks of the department receiving your application to homeschool, your exemption form, you will be exempted from attending school, and so you'll have any option during this time. You do have to do the 8 key learning areas, just like in Victoria. There is a virtual home visit, or they can come to your house if they want. but they do need to cite the child. And the standard length of registration there is 12 months. So you need to then reapply for another exemption from school attendance and have it assessed again and report against it and talk about the 8 key learning areas, etc. In Tasmania, which has quite a good and strong relationship, like the Australian Capital Territory, with representatives of the home education community, they will give you what's called provisional registration within 7 to 10 days of the application to homeschool. They will do a home visit 6 to 8 weeks after approval, and they want to see the child. You have to report against the 10 standards in the Tasmanian syllabuses, but you do not have to talk to the state syllabus there or the Australian curriculum. And again, as with most other states and territories, there is a pretty standard length of registration of around 12 months. I say around because sometimes if you apply around holidays, it can be difficult to get it in time. Okay, in Western Australia, you are immediately registered on receipt of your application. At some point in the first 3 months, you will meet with a moderator from the department, either at home or at some other location. So you can meet at a cafe, you can meet at a library, you can meet somewhere where you feel comfortable. And then you just apply yearly. At some point, the child will need to be cited, and often it's easier just to do it with the moderator, particularly if you choose a location where the child feels comfortable and safe. That can be a way that you go about it. Again, standard length of registration is 12 months, and your education is assessed against the 8 key learning areas and the WA syllabuses to provide evidence that you have thought about this in an educational fashion, and you do need to provide evidence of the child's progress. In Queensland, where I'm from, I'm very familiar with this, having done this many times myself. You are immediately registered or given provisional registration, depending on which form you use. So if you apply for registration, you'll be immediately registered. If you apply for provisional, you don't need to put in a plan on registration, but then you will need to put in a plan at some point. So you either apply with a plan for immediate registration or apply without a plan for provisional. Provisional is often used in Queensland when a young person is school refusing or school can't, because you need immediately to remove that child from the school environment. We do not do home visits in Queensland, and the child does not have to be cited, which can be very beneficial to those provisional registrants who have a child with school refusal. While you don't have to use the state syllabus or the Australian curriculum, you do have to plan around the 8 key learning areas in a fairly general sense. And when you report yearly at the 10-month mark, you have to report against 3 key learning areas. There is a mandated reporting against English. There is a mandated reporting against maths, so literacy and numeracy across all year levels. And then you can choose another learning area of your choice. So if your child is really into music, for example, you can get your music teacher to report against music as the other key learning area from the arts, and they can write the report for you. You do not have to write the report yourself. And the standard length of registration is 12 months. It is increasingly rare to be rejected in Queensland, but particularly since they have started this really great communication with the homeschool community through a parent group that has been set up to advise the department on homeschoolers' needs. The next state is the Northern Territory, which is the smallest state for homeschooling. There you have to produce a plan against the 8 key learning areas based on the Australian curriculum or some other approved curriculum. Now, when we talk about approved curriculum, we mean what ACARA means with approved curriculum. So ACARA is the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, and they are the ones who implement and manage the curriculum from grade prep or reception right up to grade 10, and then after that you go to your state's curriculum. So the approved curriculum at the moment is the Steiner Education Australia curriculum and the International Baccalaureate. You wouldn't be able to do the International Baccalaureate at home, but you can certainly do Steiner, and they tend to give a pass to Montessori, which is in the process of being registered. In the Northern Territory, the home visit doesn't happen and the child doesn't have to be cited, again, which has, as we've talked about, many benefits. And again, the standard length of registration is 12 months. So now we're going to go to the state that is quite difficult now to get registration in. So in New South Wales, the application process can take 12 weeks, and technically you're not allowed to take the child out of school while they're going through the application process. Your program is assessed at a home visit by what's called an authorised person, whom the department sends out to check on what you're suggesting and what you're going to be doing. The child has to be sighted, but the authorised person doesn't need to engage in a conversation with that child. They just need to see that they are there. You have to plan based on the 6 key learning areas in the New South Wales syllabuses. So that is, and you have to show that to the authorised person, and they will give you feedback on how you have planned around those 6 key learning areas. It is increasingly common that authorised persons will reject an application and you will have to reapply, going through the 12-week process again. The other issue in New South Wales is the variable length of registration. So you can be registered for less than 3 months. So for 3 months to less than 12 months, anything between 3 and 12 months, or for a whole 2 years. So it really depends on how the authorised person thinks about what they think about your application. Now, my concern with home visits is if you're in some areas, for example, or you don't have many books in the house, perhaps a view can be taken of your education and your capacity to provide an education that may be used to reject an application. So I just think it's really, I don't think that the home visit is appropriate. I mean, I understand why they cite the child, but the home visit is not appropriate in many cases. So let's keep talking. I'm going to talk to you now about many of the community groups that you can ask for help, who will help support you in your application, who will help support you in your homeschooling journey, and who will help support you in your reporting to departments. Who can you ask? Well, the first group is the Home Education Association. They are a national group that represents homeschoolers. They tend to have pretty good links with government in each state and territory and have quite a wide membership. If you're in the ACT, Home Education Canberra is a Facebook group. They're worth joining. All of your state and territory Facebook groups are worth joining. And there you can engage with other parents. You can find out about meetups. You can find out about information about registering and staying registered that are specific to your state and territory. HEN, the Home Education Network, provide homeschooling advice across the entire country. They are, I guess, a competitor to the Home Education Association, and they're a really lovely group of women who are very experienced in homeschooling across the entire country and are able to provide really great advice. And they work very closely with representatives in each state and territory. The Educating Parent, Homeschooling and Unschooling is a national group run by Beverly Payne, whose picture you can see there. She's a very experienced homeschooler, and now her child has gone on to homeschool her own children. So there's lots and lots of huge wealth of information there, and lots of parents get together and talk and meet, and Beverly has a booklet that is very useful for families. The Sydney Home Education Network, Vivian Fox, who has been mentioned many times in this presentation, works for this group, and they provide lots of advice around the country as well. Vivian is a very experienced advocate who has had lots of engagements with lots of different departments around the country. Homeschooling Australia provides fairly general Australian-based advice, including around travel, schooling, and again, just a group where you can meet lots of other Australian homeschoolers, but they may not be in your state and territory. Free to Homeschool in Queensland, run by the two ladies at the front, Patricia and Amanda, and they fought very hard last year to ensure that legislation was appropriate and are continuing to fight to ensure that legislation remains appropriate in Queensland and that they engage the homeschooling community effectively to help the department stay on top of the specific issues that are faced by homeschoolers. This other group in Queensland is Home Education Queensland. They are an incorporated body. You can become a member, a bit like the HEA or HEN, and they also provide Queensland-specific advice to Queensland homeschoolers that is targeted to their needs, and they are also lobbying the government to ensure that the legislation remains homeschool friendly. Homeschooling Western Australia is a state group again, also on Facebook, provides great advice. And I just really love the image of the inside of a chicken because I'm a chicken mother myself. And this is me. I'm Dr. Rebecca English. I'm a senior lecturer in education in the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice at QUT. And my work is around education choice quite broadly. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email is there. The phone is also available. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in anything that I've said today. And I'd love to connect with homeschoolers and work with you to help you find people to solve your education problems. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and I hope you have a wonderful day ahead.